Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar by EASAC-FEAM. I welcome you from a sunny Brussels today, but here we have many speakers and panelists joining us from different places. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss the joint report by EASAC and FEAM on the challenges and opportunities on regenerative medicine. My name is Rosa Castro, and I'm the Senior Scientific Policy Officer at FEAM, and I will be moderating the webinar today. But without further delay, I will give now the floor to Professor George Griffin, who is the President of FEAM, to give us a few words of introduction and welcoming, and to explain to us about FEAM. Next, we will have Dr. Robin Fierce, who will give a few words also about EASAC. Thanks, and floor is yours, George.
Thank you very much, Rosa. There we are. Good morning, everyone. My name is George Griffin. As Rosa said, it's my pleasure to be the president of FEAM and to introduce this webinar. As you know, regenerative medicine is now one of the hot topics in both biomedical science and indeed already extrapolating to clinical science. In hematology, for example, well established, and at our recent meeting in Brussels on regenerative medicine, we heard that even diabetes mellitus type 1 is now getting amenable to regenerative cell therapy. So this is a very, very timely moment to actually look and see just where we are, both in terms of the science and how that can extrapolate to benefit for medicine and for patients. And the second thing to say is this meeting is a joint meeting, of course, between FEAM, Federation of European Academies of Medicine, and EASAC, European Scientific Advice Group. And we've been working together now for several years. We work very well together, have very common aims, and it's a great pleasure that we have produced this paper together and now have this, this webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand on to Rosa, who will be moderating and introducing the speakers. So once again, welcome, and I think this is going to be a great meeting. Rosa.
Thanks so much, George. And again, I will give the floor now right directly to Dr. Robin Fierce, who is the EASAC Biosciences Program Director. We have this change in the agenda because unfortunately, Professor Volker Termeulen can not join us today. So the floor is yours, Robin.
Okay, thank you, Rosa. Yes, I'm Robin Fierce, Director of the Biosciences Program at EASAC and part of the Secretariat with Rosa for this particular project. Let me join in welcoming you all. EASAC is very pleased to co-host this webinar with FEAM. I think, as John said, the joint project demonstrated strengths of the Academy networks working in partnership. I'm just speaking for a minute or two now about EASAC. I'll then have another slot to speak about the project. But first, the slide shows you what EASAC is. It covers a wide range of scientific disciplines across the EU. It includes all of the National Academies of Science, plus several others. And we ensure that it's a mechanism to both mobilize science and to provide evidence to European policymakers and others. And actually, one of the questions I hope that we can return to in a general discussion is how we can continue to do this collectively in regenerative medicine. And as this final bullet says, we have very good working links with others in academies and elsewhere in Europe. And of course, it doesn't say that, but very much with FEAM over a number of years. Next slide. What does it do? Well, we focus on try to focus on science for policy rather than policy for research and research priorities, although inevitably, of course, we do also have to discuss research priorities during the course of identifying priorities for the evidence. Our ambition is to advise a policy-oriented audience rather than other scientists per se, but of course we engage with other scientists a great deal, and through our national academies in particular also engage with the public. As I said, EASAC is a broad organisation divided into 3 programs you see here. Biosciences program is the one that helped to support the Regenerative Medicine project. So let me finish here by thanking our audience for their participation and encourage you to be active in discussion. I know that many of you will have long experience in regenerative medicine. We look forward to hearing your views on what we're going to present and on how we can follow up further with policymakers and others to continue stimulating debate and action on some very important issues in this area. I'll hand back to Rosa now for a couple of minutes and then join you again.
Thanks so much, Robin. And I will just want to follow up from what you said to invite everyone in the audience. Unfortunately, the participants in the audience cannot ask questions lively, but they can definitely, and we would like to encourage you to use the Q&A question so that you can send us your questions either during the presentations. There will be some time for clarification questions after each presentation, although most of the discussion questions we will leave them for the end. And so the structure of the webinar will be as follows. I will first give the floor again to Dr. Robin Fears for a presentation on the project, and he will be followed then by Professor Giulio Cossu, who will give us a presentation on the report and the main messages. And as I said, we can take a few clarification burning questions right after each presentation. Right after the 2 presentations, we will have a great multi-stakeholder panel with panelists from different views, and we would also like to have more of your questions also for the panelists. The panelists will have also a chance to give short comments. So without further delay again, I would just like to give the floor again to Dr. Robin Fears for his presentation. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you again, Rosa. While the slides are coming up, here's, well, the first one is to introduce me again. You've already seen me. Just to say that I will spend a few minutes introducing the project rather than introducing the conclusions from the project and the example which Giulio will follow with. So my introduction is really to why we did it and what we did in terms of organising the project. And I'll be fairly brief so that we do have plenty of time for the panelists and for general discussion. Okay, so this slide shows a brief description of what regenerative medicine is. I'll come back to that. The point I want to emphasize is that this is an exciting area, both in the science and in the medicine. As George said, there's great promise for an increasing number of clinical indications. The research is actively underway around the world. In a number of respects, it is a strength for Europe. So exciting and promising. As yet, a relatively small number of approved clinical indications. But perhaps unfortunately, the enthusiasm and the excitement has led in some respects to a gap between expectations of what it can and will in the future deliver, and of what can actually be done at the moment in terms of translating cutting-edge technology into routine clinical practice. And part of our project and our report is to clarify that gap, discuss how it might be bridged in order to achieve the full benefit of this exciting science for patients in Europe and elsewhere, and for society. In doing that, very briefly, we focus on the need to address the science, and there are critical issues in the science, both preclinically and clinically, and to use that science to underpin robust evidence-based regulation that's needed. Otherwise, we risk wasting our investment, wasting our researchers' time, wasting the excitement that has developed significant momentum, as well, of course, undermining patient safety. Okay, next slide, please. All right, a lot has already been published and talked about on regenerative medicine, as I'm sure most of you know. Why did we want to do a new project over the last couple of years? Really, for a number of reasons, and following from, as I'll say in a minute, a previous large study by Professor Cossu and colleagues in the Lancet Commission. So already a lot has been done, but this is a rapidly advancing field, both in terms of the science and in terms of commercialization. And even though there has been a lot of significant material published previously, we felt that it would be timely to do something additionally in Europe to offer some guidance for policymakers and others, recognizing, of course, that there is already a strong framework within Europe under the responsibility of the European Medicines Agency, with particular priorities for advanced therapeutic medicinal products, and we'll hear more about that later. Our project recognised also, of course, that a number of the issues in this area and in other medicines areas are delegated to the responsibility of member states, with rather limited responsibility in some respects at the EU level itself. So our project tried to dissect out what should be done at the EU level and what should be left to the member states. The other point, just to focus at the beginning, we decided to concentrate most of our discussion on stem cells as a case study, but draw generalizable lessons where we can for other forms of regenerative medicine. Why did we focus on stem cells? Well, a couple of reasons. One is the science is a European strength, so this is of great importance across Europe. Secondly, arguably, but some stem cells are nearest to clinic. There are clinically approved preparations, and there's others in late development. So it is a issue for patients and healthcare providers. And thirdly, it's an area that's been, over the years, been involved with a number of controversies. One, for example, the embryonic stem cell origin, which we won't be covering, but there are other controversies that I and Professor Cossu will mention. Okay, next slide, please. This figure is taken from our report. I will leave it to Professor Cossu to describe more about the details of cell and other therapies. As I say, regenerative medicine is a broad area. We're focusing mainly on stem cells, but that also is a broad area with a lot of clarification needed. I refer you to our report for further detail on the different forms of stem cells, different forms of other regenerative therapy. Because I don't have time to go into detail in this brief introduction, but my next slide focuses on really organising the project. And I'll just use this slide to make a couple of points. As I said, the starting point can be seen as a relatively recent major publication from the Lancet Commission, headed by Professor Cossu, on regenerative medicine, where they concluded there was a need to do better in 4 pillars: science, funding, governance, and communication. We take forward those 4 pillars in various ways to explore what the needs are in Europe. Our working group met during the course of last year. You see the countries involved here. The geographical representation was good. As you know, it's a joint activity between FEAM and EUSAC. So both academy networks provided the secretariat for this project. But there was further geographical spread in our peer reviewers. All of our academy reports are peer reviewed independently. And again, we sought additional geographical representation in that peer review. In addition to our expert working group drawn from the academies, we gathered evidence at a meeting organised by FEAM. Patrick Celis was involved in that, and at a World Science Forum session on the ethics of regenerative medicine last November. The report was completed at the end of last year and went through, as I say, peer review and endorsement by all our member academies. This is a consensus report. It represents the views of and approval by all of our academies, as well, of course, as by our working group. But we published it in June, and it was accompanied by a short comment article in Lancet that I commend to you. And just the final point is that, of course, we are now in an active engagement phase to use our conclusions and recommendations to disseminate and follow up with various audiences, including, of course, the event today. One of those follow-up activities is a global project organised by the Global Inter-Academy Partnership, which is a group of 140 academies of science, engineering and medicine around the world. They currently have a working group on regenerative medicine. The starting point for that working group was this report in order to stimulate their discussion, and that they will produce a relatively short statement later this year to identify key issues at the global level. Next slide, please. This is a report. It's available on our websites. It's also been published as printed copies, which our secretariat can send to you if you would like printed copies. As I say, there's also a comment article in Lancet last June. Next slide, please. Okay, so I won't go into detail, but this is a list of the main topics that we wanted to address. Science and scientific leadership, particularly in Europe. I mentioned that Europe does have strengths in this area, but there is globally increasing competition in many countries for regenerative medicine, and there is a lot of money involved. So there's strong competition worldwide, which of course puts pressure on the pace of the science and the pace of efforts to approve and commercialize that science. That perhaps leads to issues for the quality of the evidence base and how to improve that evidence base preclinically and clinically. In Europe and around the world, it also raises issues for regulatory frameworks, particularly in terms of characterization of a complex biological product, which all regenerative medicine is, the very legitimate desire to accelerate access to effective therapies, safe, effective therapies, but what is there a compromise involved in doing that? And an era of evolving business models around the world. When we wrote this report, of course, we didn't realize that there was also very much a changing world in consequence of COVID-19. But the world has changed in many respects, not least our ability to do clinical trials in the way that was done previously. And of course, in consequence of the response to COVID, there have been great pressures to accelerate science and accelerate regulation and approval of the products of that science. So the world is changing. To 2 points. One is, as I say, within the authorized approval systems around the world, there's a balance to be struck between appropriate evidence for safety and efficacy and doing it as fast as possible. And that is an issue that we talk about in the report and hope we'll talk about further in our discussion. There's another major issue, however, the behavior of unregulated and unscrupulous clinics around the world offering to desperate people products which have not been approved, which do not have a good scientific basis for their efficacy and safety, which are offered for profit, and as I say, often to desperate patients and their families who may think they have no other options. So there is a big issue there for Europe, but also worldwide, how to control this unscrupulous provision of products without any evidence. So more broadly, how do we balance the promotion of innovation and patient protection in this area? I will just finish my presentation to say there's a lot of issues to discuss, and Professor Cossu will exemplify those. One, of course, those issues is ethics. A number of issues for ethics in regenerative medicine that we talk about in the report, and we did involve expert ethicists. I will just, in my last slide, please, Joanna, focus on listing some of those concerns and really raising the question with regard to these concerns, the safety, efficacy, patient consent, use of information, professional responsibilities, fairness for patients and for health services. Are the issues for regenerative medicine any different from other medicine? Are they bigger? Are they different? Look forward to discussing that further in our panel and general discussion. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and hand back to Rosa.
And thanks so much, Robin, again for this presentation. I'll take the opportunity that we are ahead of time just to say that it was great for FEAM, for the Federation of European Academies of Medicine, to work on this project. Indeed, as a person working on the bioethics and legal side of things, I think the issues around new medical technologies, such as regenerative medicine, are indeed, from an ethical and from a regulatory point of view, even more challenging than usual, because these technologies are, as you mentioned, evolving very fastly, and our regulatory systems sometimes need to catch up, so to say, but this is my own personal view here. And I don't want to delay anymore. I don't see any burning questions on the Q&A feature, but I just want to remind everyone that you can either send your questions and we will take them after the presentation or just after the panel discussion. So the floor is now for Professor Giulio Cossu, who will give us an overview of the report and with examples and recommendation. I will leave him to introduce himself, but he's a professor from the University of Manchester. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm also speaking to you from sunny Manchester. So for once, there is sunshine in Manchester, and we are all enjoying it this last part of the summer. So I will be quite brief, and I will start with two examples of clear success of stem cell therapy. I will talk very briefly about congenital immune deficiency and epidermolysis bullosa. But the diseases that you see here have essentially been cured. Now there are follow-up up to 15 years, and patients who were treated for congenital immune deficiency 15 years ago are now young adults living a normal life. They would all be dead within a very few years without therapy. Same for cases of, and this is I would say, quite important European achievement, because this was carried out in three main centers: at San Raffaele in Milan, at Necker in Paris, and the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. Lysosomal storage disease have been treated with the same criterion of an autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation after genetic correction of the autologous cells. And the same thing, although the tissue was different, happened for epidermolysis bullosa. I have put also hemophilia in this list, but right now the follow-up is too short to make conclusion. There are many, many more other diseases where mainly rather than donor stem cell transplantation what seems to be at the moment the major route is through autologous stem cell transplantation after in vitro modification, what is called ex vivo gene therapy. If I may have the next slide, please. So this is an example from the San Raffaele in Milan for the disease called ADA-SCID. I won't go into detail, but very briefly, the hematopoietic stem cell of the patient are isolated, transduced in vitro with the, once it was a retroviral, now is a lentiviral vector encoding the missing enzyme, in this case, adenosine deaminase. And after that, the patient who has been mildly conditioned in order to create space for the donor cell is transplanted and monitored for the reappearance of lymphocytes that are not produced under in case of this disease. And as I told you before, there are now dozens of patients. There have been only one severe adverse event in Paris about 20 years ago, and this led to a massive investigation into the cause of what is called now insertional mutagenesis, where the vector lands up in a dangerous part of the genome and has induced the cell to proliferation, as it happened for 4 children in Paris. One of them, unfortunately, died. But other than that, after that, there will not be more severe adverse event with this therapy. If I can have the next slide. And this is probably the most spectacular and recent case that shows us how stem cell therapy can really change the rules of the game. So this is Hassan. Hassan is a child from Syria. He had to escape, and he was also affected by epidermolysis bullosa, which is this quite rare, but not so rare, genetic disease where one protein anchoring the epidermis to the dermis is missing, in this case, a laminin chain, and therefore the epidermis comes away. That gives also the name of butterfly babies. Obviously, when this is severe and covers most of the skin, the life of these patients is terrible, and you can add to this what was a travel from Syria to Germany. So when the child arrived to Germany, he was essentially considered hopeless because about 90% of the skin had gone, and he had developed infections by Staphylococcus and other, I don't remember which are. Anyway, because some part of the skin was spared, the group of Michele De Luca, in collaboration with the German dermatologist, collected a little part of the skin, expanded the cell in vitro, transduced them with a retroviral vector expressing the missing chain of the laminin, and the corrected cells in 3 subsequent successive steps were transplanted back to Hassan. And here you can see the skin of Hassan. Now Hassan is back to school, is living a normal life, he's playing football with his friends, and the follow-up is now 5 years. So we don't know how long the stem cell that have been cured and have taken over, because subsequent biopsies shown that only few stem cell, long-living stem cell, are sufficient to maintain the regeneration of the skin, at least for 5 years, as we can say now. But a prediction would be that this will last for the life of the patients, as we have learned for the autotransplantation of epidermis in the large burn, the work pioneered by Howard Green about 50 years ago. So if I can have the next slide. Now, this is great, but unfortunately, right now, as Robin was saying before me, the success in cell and gene therapy has been the exception, whereas failure or partial failure or limited success, depending how you want to call them, have been the rule. And there are scientific reasons why. In a nutshell, we can say that the main reason is that success has been seen in those kind of cell transplantation where it's possible to make space for the donor cell. So in the case of bone marrow transplantation with myeloablation, you can kill part of the resident cell that are sick and cannot function normally and make space for the genetically corrected cell. In the case of the epithelia, you the surgeon surgically removes the epithelium, be it the epidermis or the cornea or the urethra, and then virtually 100% of the cell are donor and are genetically corrected. But now if you rather look at disease that affect the central nervous system or heart or muscle, then you cannot ablate the diseased tissue. So that engraftment by the cells will be unavoidably low, and you have to work out ways to get to a clinical success. And many labs all over the world are working towards direction. Now, this is all nice and good, but the situation is slightly more complex. And it's more complex because since probably 15 years now, a number of private clinics have begun to advertise and commercialize therapies based on stem cell that would promise a therapy for virtually any disease. And as Paolo Bianco and Doug Seep reported in a Nature commentary, you have to sell therapies. You cannot sell hopes. And this has led to a business of many, many million euros or dollars or whatever. And these clinics have flourished all over the world, not in specific countries. You can find them in Switzerland, in Germany, in UK, in US, everywhere. And they represent a double damage, maybe a triple damage to the field. First, because they lead to the conclusion that stem cell is the work of charlatans. And it's very difficult to distinguish between one and the other, especially, as we will see in a minute, because recently they have somehow refined their techniques. Second, they create false illusion in patients, or even worse, in parents of young patients who are desperate for a therapy and there is none on the market. And third, because they also cause a significant economic burden for a therapy that most of the time, if not all the time, turns out to be ineffective. So this has been pointed out by many before us. The International Society for Stem Cell Research, for example, published guidelines twice. But in the end, the problem persists because it's very difficult to have any kind of legal action against this company. They have very good lawyers who prepare contracts that the patient have to sign and essentially protect the company from any kind of complaint that the patient will eventually see when they realize that the therapy has not worked. Now, but recently, and that was probably one of the main reasons of this new document coming out from EASAC and FEAM, the situation has changed because many of these clinics have begun to hire professionals who are able to write a good protocol. The protocol is eventually even available. It's no longer magic stem cell, but specific stem cell derived from the bone marrow or the adipose tissue. They're sufficiently characterized. There is often a rationale behind this protocol, and often, or at least sometimes, the result of the trial is published on a more than respectable journal. At this point, not only patients, but even experts in the field may have difficulty in recognizing and distinguishing a serious clinical trial from a commercial enterprise. And here is probably the only point that is relevant. Patient, at least in Europe, because in US the situation is completely different, patients should not pay to participate to a clinical trial. The money has to be found by the researchers, by the clinicians, but unless I cannot guarantee you, and in Europe, of course, we had examples like Celis or more recently gene therapy products that are efficacious, but cost a fortune. And even though it's not among the mission of EASAC-FEAM to get into specific health economics problem, we cannot ignore that for health systems that are in generally almost bankrupted all over Europe and have been challenged dramatically by the COVID epidemics now, it will be more and more difficult to provide these therapies, especially when it's not the case of ADA-SCID patients who are 20 in Europe. But when we move to disease like hemophilia or cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy, where patients are in the number of thousands. And the other important thing is that, as I told you, the scenario has changed so that you do not have the good and the bad on different sides. There is a continuum, and very often, very small companies, in order to survive, they have to push towards clinical trial in order to get a marketing authorization. And as Robin was pointing out before, sometimes the preclinical evidence is insufficient. And you may be aware of a tragic event that happened July this year, where 2 patients affected by myotubular myopathy enrolled in a clinical trial by Audentes had severe adverse event due to AAV, in this case was an in vivo gene therapy overload, and both died. So this is something that we should always keep in mind. But as I tell you, I will leave you many more questions than answer. We should find a way to balance the risk with the possibility of a therapy, because the only way to eliminate any risk from regenerative medicine is to stop new trials. It's impossible to have a new trial without a risk, but as far as possible, the risk should be known, predictable, and calculated. If we go back to the case of the 2 children, the dose of AAV to get a clinical benefit in the muscle was huge, and the possibility of a toxicity, no, the AAV is not a toxic vector. It's just that if you give a ton, you can kill people even with water. And that's something that should be kept in mind for the future. And finally, the last point I want to make, if I can have the next slide, which probably should be the last one. It's accelerated approval or hospital exemption or compassionate use are very important instruments to get to the possibility of therapy for patients who have no alternative. And for example, the case of Hassan and the child cured from epidermolysis bullosa was out of a protocol because the child was dying. The therapy had been tried and published 10 years before in a study by the same group. And the ethics committee in Germany decided that there was sufficient pre-existing evidence and relatively low risk for a patient that in any case would have been dying in the next week or 2. And, but in other cases, the evidence is insufficient, and it's very difficult to reach a wise decision between moving forward when you think you really could help a patient and exposing this patient to unjustified risk. There's a very nice review that I recommend on JAMA that you can see here. I recommend you that you read, because it points out what are the problems in this field. And the final, I think I've finished my slides. The final, okay, here we go. the final important point is what can be done at the European level and what has to be delegated unavoidably to local regulation. In principle, it would be much better to have a single regulation all over Europe. But with the winds blowing in these years, I'm afraid this will be everything but simple. So to conclude, the recommendation of the report were to engage with patient and public, especially, doing some kind of outreach activity in school, in university. For example, that I'm aware, there are very few, if any, courses of regenerative medicine in the medical schools of all over Europe. I give a lecture here and there in Manchester or elsewhere where they invite me. But these are more seminar. They're a structured course where you do cell therapy, gene therapy, tissue engineering, and so on and so forth. We have already discussed how the regulatory frameworks should be robust, evidence-based, and transparent and harmonized. But as we probably will discuss later, this again is very difficult to achieve. We have discussed about the unscrupulous clinics, but again, addressing issue in fundamental biology, in clinical research is of paramount importance. However, these things take years, a lot of money, and very often the need to come with to get it to a product, to have something that a small company can sell, becomes dominant to the very survival of the company. And that creates obviously a conflictual situation. So better partnership between academia and industry may help from this point of view. And finally, also, even leaving aside the pirate journals that publish anything you want in exchange for money, but even the what are called respectable journals have, and we have seen that year after year, a tendency to favor the scoop. So the more you push your results, the higher the chance that the editors will be impressed and publish. Whereas if you are scrupulous and report all the plus and minus of your results, the chance that the paper will not be published in a high-profile journal becomes higher. And that is something for which discussion should be engaged with editors of journals. I want to remind that all this initiative that led to the first Lancet Commission was an idea of Richard Horton, and we worked together for about 2 years to get to that report. Okay, I think I've told you everything I wanted, and I'll be happy to listen to these other speakers and then engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giulio, for that fascinating presentation on the scientific really expectation, promises from regenerative medicine, and then the hurdles and the risk, I think, in this delicate balance between provided rapid access to these therapies and making sure the regulatory approval system is robust and meets with all the ethical and legal expectations, right? I have a few questions myself, but I think it's much better if we give the floor to our wonderful multi-stakeholder panel we have today with us. And I'm sure, and I again encourage everyone in the audience to send us the question. And it's a bit difficult because we don't see you, but you can definitely send us the question, use the Q&A or the chat if you prefer to send us questions. And so first of all, I would like to welcome Patrick Celis, who's joining us today from the European Medicines Agency, and the floor is yours also to introduce yourself, Patrick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me okay. So I am Patrick Celis, and I'm working at European Medicines Agency for quite a while now, and I have been involved in the regulation for advanced therapies since I think 2005, and thereafter being responsible for the running of the scientific secretariat of the Committee for Advanced Therapies. So that's a bit my background. So a lot of the observations made in the report are very valid and very much in line with observations we have made, be it then from the other side, not the side of the developer or the academia, but the side of the regulator. And I can agree that over the last couple of years, the issue of unauthorized cell-based advanced therapies or unproven ATMPs has become more and more of an issue. As included in the report already in 2010, when the Committee for Advanced Therapies was 1 or 2 years old, we came out with a statement to warn the patients of this type of practices and clearly stating that they should look for products that are either authorized in clinical trials or under an review by authorities, be it hospital exemption or compassionate use. But nevertheless, it's very difficult for this type of messages to get across to the public in large. Other regulators, FDA and others, have encountered similar problems and have published similar statements. And even very recently, in April this year, CAT issued a second of such a statement, trying to increase patient protection by reiterating the dangers involved with using of this unproven, mainly cell-based therapies. Perhaps I stop here for a moment and give the floor to other panelists.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Well, I leave the floor indeed to now Thomas Bols. We're very pleased that we have now the view from industry. Thomas Bols is joining us. He's in the PTC Therapeutics, and today he's representing EUCOPE. And I will leave it to Thomas to explain to us what EUCOPE is, but thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Rosa. Thank you, FEAM and EASAC for inviting me to this panel and need to be able to participate in this important topic. So indeed, my name is Thomas Bols. Just as an introduction, my day job is to work for, indeed, for a biopharmaceutical company called PTC Therapeutics, which is a company that focuses on rare diseases exclusively and uses different technologies, but also gene therapies. We're hoping to get approval for our first gene therapy next year for a rare disease that's called AADC deficiency. And then as a professional hobby, we are indeed a member of EUCOPE, which is an industry federation, as you say, that brings together, I would say, indeed research-based biopharmaceutical companies. And I would also say predominantly the more smaller companies, although larger usual suspect biopharmaceutical companies are also a member, but the majority are more smaller companies. And we have a working group on ATMPs or regenerative medicines, of which I'm a member. So that's basically my interest. I'm not a scientist. I work in public policy. So if the questions are too difficult, I will have to pass them on. But a couple of observations. I think also just I think what is this, maybe even what Patrick said, I think we also as industry would agree with a lot of what is said in the report and also some of the other observations in terms of high hopes of what this therapy will bring. But it is also indeed a very novel area where a lot of framework conditions are maybe not completely settled, whether it's the regulatory framework or even the market access framework is not entirely settled, because we feel that the system is still very much geared towards, if I can say, traditional small molecule or even biologics and chronic therapies and so on. And we face that every day, from how you do research all the way how do you reimburse it and all the important elements in between, like clinical trials. We also think, and that's maybe also what's covered in the report and what we look at as well, that there is a bit of a difference between, if you very simply say, indeed, you have sort of small molecules chemically derived medicines. You have to, let's call them the classic biologics, and then the ATMPs. One thing, and the report is addressing that, while the first two categories were predominantly manufactured by indeed sort of a larger, let's say, commercial enterprises like pharmaceutical companies, when we talk about cell and gene therapies, we certainly have other stakeholders very much involved in that as well. Hospitals make these kind of therapies as well, and that sort of has changed a little bit the dynamics and the discussions. And I think part of that you address in your report, and we feel also that that hasn't really been settled yet. Again, by the authorities, it's very well regulated from what companies should do, clinical trials, how you get the marketing authorization, etc. But what the other stakeholders that are also active in this field should do is a little bit more fluid, and we think that that needs to be addressed. When I just briefly look at the report, yes, we also have that concern about entities developing ATMPs, but we as an industry don't really make a distinction between, as the report does, between I don't know what is the correct word for it, let's say rogue operators and others. We see it more like you either have a centrally approved therapy where you have to go through all the well-established steps to get a marketing authorization, or, and I think Patrick alluded to it, you can either, you will find access to certain therapies if you're in a clinical trial, or under compassionate use or the hospital exemption rule. And in particular, the latter, we have looked at very carefully. What does the regulation, the ATMP regulation, state regarding being able to produce a ATMP under the hospital exemption rule? And they're pretty clear. As I said, there should be an unmet medical need. They should not be promoted. They should not be commercially made available, and they should be provided to pay on almost a named patient basis in the country where the therapy is being developed. And that's sort of our guidance, and what we've noticed, and what we also really encourage, again, European Commission and others to look at, that doesn't seem to correspond very much with the reality, right? So we see all kind of indeed therapies being developed that do not correspond to those criteria, and we don't think that's very much in the interest of patients in the first place, because we don't know what happens with patients, follow-up, pharmacovigilance, etc. But we also think, and that's also of course important for us, it's also not good for the whole image indeed of ATMPs going forward. We want this technology to be successful, and we want patients in the first place, but society overall to maintain confidence in this technology, because there are indeed high hopes on it, and these kind of developments are not particularly useful. So that's one element that we think. The other element in the report where we have maybe a little bit more, not concerns about, what we would really like to get some feedback is about essentially what it says is that therapies are being developed and even pushed with very limited data, right? If I can put it in a nutshell, and there's some concerns about that. And so one of the challenges, I think, or one of the issues that the industry is discussing is, how do you overcome that? Because again, if you compare ATMPs with let's call them traditional medicines, there are some stark differences. One is that ATMPs, at least where we focus on, are typically focusing on rare diseases, right? Not exclusively, but quite to a large extent. And there you have the number of patients in those therapies are very small, and sometimes in my own companies it's really small. 1 in 200,000 is the number we have for ADC deficiency. So the idea of generating before marketing authorization through the standard approach, like a large phase 3 randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled clinical trial, are simply not possible. You cannot do it, right? And also even this sort of using the word placebo-controlled trials is also not always possible, because again, if I can just use my own company's advice, the gene therapy will have to be administered directly into the brain with a stereotactic surgery. And so you cannot have a placebo arm, right? So I'm not saying I have the solution here, but if you're faced with that sort of situation where, as I said, the number of patients are very small, so you can't do large clinical trials, and sometimes the technology is indeed so sophisticated that you can't have a sort of placebo control arm or whatever. Per definition, to us, it sounds like, therefore, the evidence, the emphasis on generating the evidence will shift to post-marketing. And then you get into the discussion about real-world evidence, etc. And so we're having good discussions about what should be the framework for robust registries, real-world evidence, etc. And that's a little bit what I missed in the report. There's indeed, and perhaps to a certain extent, some legitimate, but sometimes not so legitimate, if I can say, criticism and this lack of evidence and pushing half-baked therapies. But we haven't seen really, okay, how do you address that then? Because this is the situation that we're facing, as I just described, in terms of numbers of patients. So maybe, I think I've talked already too long. So these are, but overall, as I said, the issue is very important, and a number of recommendations. I was just looking at Professor Cossu's slide, the last one. I couldn't see any of the recommendations where we wouldn't agree with, or we would agree with all of those. We think these are indeed very important issues, and we fully support those recommendations. It's in the details that come in the report where we maybe have sometimes a little bit different opinion. That's my, thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas, for your, for sharing with us the views from industry, which I think it enriches a lot. I see hands rising from Giulio and from George. Can I give the floor just very quickly to George, then to Giulio, if you formulate your questions, and then I would like to keep also the time for Cor, who is joining us from the patient side. But George, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rosa. Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. You mentioned very briefly compassionate use. And that, of course, is important. And we all know of the Formula One driver with severe brain damage who had treatment in Paris with stem cells. But how do you think compassionate use should be regulated? And presumably the company providing cells and so on is pivotal in doing this. But what about the ethical stance for compassionate use? Yeah.
Well, I'm not a great expert in compassionate use programs, but from industry, the experience that I see is very much that companies are involved in compassionate use when there is already a pathway to getting the product approved through a centralized approval system. So you already have a therapy, either part of clinical trial, and maybe even already sometimes compassionate use programs already exist after having filed. There are compassionate programs in place when there is already a marketing authorization, but there hasn't been a pricing and reimbursement decision, for example. So as I said, the bigger umbrella expression compassionate use, I'm not so familiar with. When it comes to compassionate use programs in which pharmaceutical companies are engaged, I would say typically they are engaged in, as I said already, a pathway to getting that therapy approved through the regular pathway. So, presenting your data to EMA, getting it reviewed, and hopefully receiving a marketing authorization. But I do think that indeed compassionate use and the conditions, and then I think there is a mirror to it with the hospital exemption one, can be regulated somewhat better, but how exactly, I don't know. Maybe Patrick has a more clear view on that than I have.
With that.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I don't know if Patrick wants to speak now, or if I give the floor to Giulio.
I can very, very quickly. Compassionate use is something that is implemented at the level of the individual member states.
Yeah.
So I'm not certainly the person to give the answer or the advice on what would be best. It's correct that for products that are under development or products that are under evaluation, even compassionate use is sometimes used for those patients that are outside of inclusion criteria of clinical trials, or like said, once approved to get the product to the patients before authorization is agreed.
Yeah.
That all exists. Now, of course, a lot of the low-level activities, or perhaps the hospital developed strategies, they are more prone to approach the national authorities for compassionate use. And there the border with hospital exemption is sometimes a little bit blurred, and it might also sometimes be a decision of the national authority to rather go into the hospital exemption route and push the applicants, the academic hospital developers, into that route, or go for the compassionate use route. Hospital exemption is indeed a very tricky one, implemented very diverse in the different member states, and making life not easy. I know that the European Commission is trying to come up with some criteria to harmonize hospital exemption, but as being a national responsibility, it is very difficult to come there with a European standard for this type of products. Perhaps I stop here for a moment.
Thanks so much. And Giulio, do you have a question before we go with the last?
Very quickly, I just want to comment on the point made by Thomas, which obviously I agree 100%. When you deal with a very rare disease, you cannot follow the usual track. It's simply impossible. However, what I want to say is that nowadays, and even 10 years ago, you should have, and everybody had, animal models for the disease. Some were natural, like the MDX. Other are created every day by Jackson Lab, and they're quite affordable. So every company, every academic group must have tested the protocol on mice with the same disease. Problem is that in the mice, very often the disease is milder. A classic case is muscular dystrophy, but there are numberless. So that the difference between a significant improvement to be measured in a small animal, and that's why it would be better to repeat the protocol once successful in the mouse, in a large animal that also can be now genome edited. You know, there are dystrophic pigs. You can create essentially any disease in any species, but it's extremely expensive, time consuming, and sometimes is simply logistically impossible. One cannot ask for the moon, especially with the perspective of a market that is so small that it will be very difficult to see how, you know, one can make a profit, because at the end of the day, the goal of the company is to make a profit. If you have 20 patients, how will you make a profit? Unless you charge £2 million for each treatment, and then, you know, you move the problem on the shoulder of the NHS. So just to say, but sometimes, and I close here, companies seem to present the data of the mouse in a way that looks more promising than actually is. You know, Terry Partridge used to say there's not a single dystrophic mouse left in Europe and North America that has not been cured today. But when you move to dogs and then to patients, the situation, unfortunately, is very different. Just to add this to your point, which I think was well taken anyway.
Thanks, Giulio. And I think we have now a lot of very important questions that have been around and raised by all of you, including and very important issue of what should be done at the EU level and what should happen at national level. And I know I'm mentioning this because we are also joined today by many representatives of our national academies who are listening to us. And part of the follow-up work of EASAC-FEAM is to take these messages and to promote further discussion at national level. Apart from the fact that, as Robin mentioned, there will be work also at international level. in a project that will look at this. But last but not least, we have been hearing a lot about the implications for patients and the importance of involving patients. And we are very pleased and honored that today Cor Oosterwijk, and I apologize for the pronunciation already, is here with us. He is CEO of the National Patient Alliance for Rare and Genetic Diseases from the Netherlands. And we want to hear from you. Cor, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon now. My name is Cor Oosterwijk, but that's always difficult for foreigners to pronounce that well, so I forgive you. Since 2001, I'm the director of the National Patient Alliance for Rare and Genetic Diseases in the Netherlands. We have 90 patient organizations as a member in the rare and genetic disease field. We have 1 million people in the Netherlands with a rare or genetic disease at a population of 70 million people. And in Europe, we have 30 to 35 million people with a rare and or genetic disease. So the problem is challenging. In the past, I'm educated as a medical biologist. I've been teaching biotechnology for 2 years. I've done basic research in the field of diabetes, creating transgenic mice. I've also been educating how to create transgenic cows, but they are not there anymore now. And I've been a clinical trial manager for 5 years in the cardiovascular field before I became a patient advocate. So that's my background. We are also strongly connected to European umbrellas like European Patient Forum and RODIS. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, trying to bring forward good ideas. I've written down some points after reading the report yesterday, and it was a joy to read it on the one hand, because it gave a good picture of what's going on in the field and the problems, although nowadays you should say challenges, but I think it still are problems, and there are a lot of problems. About 15 years ago, I was a partner in the project called Concert, in which the bubble boy was treated, the Paris bubble boy, which was already mentioned. And it struck me that the problems then are still the problems now. And I'm used to slow progress in Europe, but in this field, things are really going rather slow. So I also got a little bit depressed of all the problems. And I noticed that nearly for all problems, the European Commission was addressed as a big brother who should solve all the problems. And what I learned from advocacy is that you are addressing a certain stakeholder to solve a problem, it helps them to also show what you are going to do yourself. So, and that applies to all stakeholders, also to the academic communities. And in the Netherlands, we have a royal academic community. So if you want to lobby for this, you should also offer something from yourself. What are you going to do yourself to improve the situation? So that's one of the points I want to mention. Of course, I was focusing on what's mentioned in the project, in the paper about patient engagement. And I noticed that it was addressed in several ways. Sometimes patient organizations are still called patient groups. Sometimes it seems they are very influential by industry. And in other sentences, it's mentioned that they are very useful. And I think it's very important to distinguish between the role of patients in such a trajectory and the role of patient organizations. Patients organizations can have a very useful role in defining the research agenda, also in this specific field, and they have already been thinking about research priorities, so use them for that. And they also have been thinking about clinical endpoints in clinical research. And in the paper, the example is mentioned of the 6-minute walking test for neuromuscular disorders, stating that this is not a good endpoint, and indeed it is. And also patients are not happy with this kind of endpoints. And collective knowledge is in the patient organization. So if you want to have better endpoints, just contact the patient organization. What also will be helpful to have balanced patient representation in ethical committees. Because especially in this field, to find a balance between risk-benefit and what you allow the individual patient to decide about the size of the risks he or she wants to take, then it's also important to already have this input in the ethical committees. And like with other issues like orphan drugs and gene therapy, in many, at least in my country, but I suppose also in other countries, knowledge is limited within the ethical communities about this kind of specialized field. So how to work together with regard to ethical assessment and to scientific advice at the European level, instead of having a lot of ethical committees having their own opinions and slowing down progress in this field. I'm a member of the Dutch Appraisal Committee advising the Minister of Health whether or not to reimburse orphan drugs and other expensive interventions. And things are not that different between orphan drugs and this kind of therapies because it are all orphan interventions. And if I read then in the report that there should be more basic research and there should go more money go to basic research, on the one hand, yes, we want to stimulate this field, but on the other hand, if we in Europe and internationally don't first solve the issue of reimbursement of this kind of expensive therapies, then we can fill the pipeline at the beginning. But if we don't solve the problems at the end, I think we should more focus on this. And in the field of research, there's hardly any knowledge by researchers, and I forgive them because it's their job, of what may happen at the end of the trajectory, having the therapies they are developing reimbursed. So also their knowledge should be increased about the problems or challenges, whatever you mention it, that will happen at the end of this pipeline. But because if you don't do so, then you will see same things happens as are now happening in the orphan drug field, that small biotech companies are taken over for a lot of money by big pharma, and then it's not the investment in innovation that we as payers are paying for, but we are then paying for satisfying the stakeholders of these small biotech companies. And this may then also happen in the future, the field of biotech companies working on cell therapies and other ATMPs in this field. So I don't want to depict a pessimistic scenario, but we have to be aware of this, and that this kind of things may happen also in this field. Then about funding for research, that should also include, then one is looking, for example, in this report for broadening the scope of IMI and also expanding this to SMAs. Yes, maybe that's useful, but what I'm missing then in the report, how the cooperation and the partnerships with patient organizations should be funded, and how public campaigns should be funded. In the Netherlands, there's now a campaign going on, funded by the European Union, about bread. We all should eat more bread, and that's funded by the European Union. Why is there not a European campaign in the field of healthcare? why is there not more investment in healthcare by the European Commission, whereas 70% of our citizens is advocating for that? I'm over my 5 minutes, I'm afraid, although I promised. And finally, I want to mention, I suppose that you know what's going on in the field of rare diseases, namely that's now a rather successful European cooperation in the European reference networks. And I think also this field can learn from that, and maybe there should also be European reference networks for cell therapy or things like that. At least there's a lot of things going on, and DG Sante is very proud of this. So how can we learn from this kind of European cooperation and national government appointing specialized centers with input of patients? Finally, well, I think we are all responsible for creating hope and for raising expectations. I think patient organizations may do so, but also academic researchers, because they sometimes over-exaggerate the success of their work in order to have a next funding. And industry is doing so. So we all are responsible for the balance between hope and hype. And I invite you to work more together. And I invite you to have in the next version of this document also a paragraph on working with patient organizations. Thank you, and apologies for talking too long.
Thanks so much, Cor, and no, I think it was great to hear from you, and I don't see any hands that are raised there on the panel. I'll go back to George very soon. Just to say, there were a few discussions on the chat, and it was mainly a question about the clinics that are not approved and the fact that there was an article about this problem in Poland, but I think Giulio already answered that unfortunately the problem is very widespread. Now, I don't see any more questions from the public, but before giving the floor to George, I would just also like to invite everyone to think about that last question about, you know, we have different angles here: researchers, scientists, regulators, patients, industry. What would you do from your own angle? And do you think there was something else, you know, something else you would like to see in this report, if it was going to happen again? And George, the floor is yours.
Cora, I very much enjoyed your talk, and two things I'd just like to say. Your idea of patient groups is so very, very important, and creating hope for patients with severe disease that may be amenable to regenerative medicine is very attractive to those groups. Of course, it must be realistic, but nevertheless, it is there in the patient's mind. I have a rare disease, I need hope. And I think that's a very important concept to have. The other thing, you mentioned ethical committees, and a lot of the things we've been talking about today are not within the expertise of ethical committees. And I just wonder if in each of the countries, and Patrick has made it clear that there is a national responsibility for discussing particularly compassionate use, for example, if there should be a special competency committee for regenerative medicine, which may well be outside of the competence of many ethical committees. I'd be interested to hear your views on that, Cor.
Yes, I would be very much in favor of this. And I think we have a similar discussion now going on the role of Europe in HTA. And what I see then is that the academic community and the patient community, they all are addressing the European Commission or the European Parliament to set up a new something or a new institution who could start working on this. But why are not you, as very much respected academic societies, joining forces and just setting up such a European committee and formulating ethical advice? And although it will not have a formal status and maybe it will not be endorsed by the European Commission or whatever, it will undoubtedly taken over by ethical committees at the national or local level, knowledge in this field, and will be very grateful to have such a respected advice in the field of ethics or in the field of HTA as far as the scientific part is concerned. So why not just doing it yourself, and then maybe after a few years it will be recognized by the European Commission or by the EMA, but you are very much respected societies, so you can start with it.
Well, Cor, I'm pleased to be able to tell you close to your home in the Netherlands, the Royal Netherlands Academy, KNAW. I'm on a committee which, as an external observer, looking at modifying the regulatory framework for new drugs. And I can make sure they get these messages that we've been talking about today. And the European Medicines Agency is involved in this piece of work, and they've been advising, and there will be a report published. But it's the ethical committees and the ethical approval has been a thing that has worried me for quite a long time, actually, in just how competent these bodies are. But I can assure you I will pass your messages on to this group in the Netherlands. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, George and Cor. And now we're approaching really the end of the webinar. I don't see any hands raised there, but anyone or everyone want to give a final comment or message on maybe the issue that you would prioritize in the next discussions? As Robin, I think, mentioned at the beginning, this is a very rapidly evolving field, and work will be done in the future, and academics will be engaged in this. Do you have any burning questions you would like to see addressed?
Can I just, could I just pick on the competency issue? Because I not only do I agree, but I don't think it's only a competence issue. And it's also, what I wanted to say at the end is also, I see Cor's point as well, that every time there's an issue that we want to create a new European committee to address it and so on. But I think the underlying issue that certainly also we see, certainly when you are a more sort of mid-sized company, PTC, we have 200 people in Europe, right? 200. So so it's for us to have these kind of things more harmonized or more centralized. Is not a sometimes you can put this in political discussion. I don't want to get there into are you in favor of European integration or not. It's a pure efficiency and survival consideration. We cannot deal with 20 ethical committees that all have different opinions, and yes, some of them are competent and others are not. We cannot deal with Cor mentioned the HTA with more than 27 HTA procedures that again are sometimes competent, sometimes not competent, but definitely have different requirements and so on, right? The only model that I think at the moment seems to work is exactly Patrick's organization, EMA. We're so grateful to have had just one organization that gives one marketing authorization that then applies to the whole of Europe, that is based on science, and you get an approval. You cannot. I mean, if there's one final message I would want to give is that all the other elements that we discussed, ethical committees, how you organize clinical trials, how you do HTA, it would really be good if we get some more harmonization around that, because the system is just very, very inefficient and contradicting, and doesn't really work for at least the group that I represent, the sort of smaller companies.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Anyone else that wants to comment on that? Or
Perhaps I can just add here, this is Patrick. I think this is some of the things that we learned over the last 10 years, is that it's not only to get products approved that is important, and I would also agree what Thomas said, is that it's not so much that products that come have not been thoroughly tested. So I don't agree with that one either. So it's not the approval which per se is the issue and the downstream financing is the issue. It is very clear that health technology assessment bodies and reimbursement bodies need to be much more involved and much earlier involved in the product development. From our side, we tried this a little bit, but it's still voluntary. And if there could be some more internationalization at European level or even at sub-European level, would certainly be beneficial, because it's very bad to have products that are intended to treat unmet medical needs approved and then patients not having access because reimbursement is not possible. And I do recognize that this is a national authority, it's national money, but nevertheless, a bit of harmonization there or a lot of harmonization there would be certainly beneficial for patients. And the little we can help from European Medicines Agency, we will do. We offer this possibility for involving health technology assessment bodies early in product development via scientific advices, but it is voluntary and it is on request of the company. So a bit of advertisement towards companies, certainly not to forget this possibility.
Thanks so much, Patrick, and thanks for these comments on the health technology assessment. We're taking notes of the pressing issues here too. And next I have Cor that wanted to say a comment.
Well, I just wanted to join Thomas in he stressed the importance of registries. In this field where randomized clinical trials are so difficult, we need historical controls, we need long-term follow-up. And what now happens is that you only see a temporary registry connected to the clinical research. And when the research is done, the registry disappears. So it's a responsibility, I think, also for EMA to stimulate industries and academics to set up a more permanent registry once they start clinical research. They can then work together with NGOs, patient organizations, national governments to make registries really sustainable. I think this can help to get a lot of answers in the uncertainties we have now.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Cor, again. And I see George wants to
just one last comment. Patrick, what you said is music to my ears. I worked in America for a couple of years, a long time ago, and it was very common for academics and for drug companies to speak directly to the FDA early on in drug development. And the FDA at that time were well known that if something was submitted very late with no prior contact, they would tear it to pieces, and quite rightly so. And they would say, we don't want surprises. We are here to help, and rather than destroy. And Patrick, I think that's exactly what you were saying about the EMA, and is a very good way to finish this meeting, I think, actually, to say we're all in this together. We all need advice and help, and the central body is a good one to do it, as well as scientists themselves talking to each other, of course.
Well, definitely this was a very good first step into remaining in constant dialogue with each other and learning from each other. So if no one else has final comments, I would say that for some of us, lunchtime might be approaching. So I see that also maybe participants are leaving us at this point, and you also are very busy in your agendas, probably making sure that the whole regenerative medicine field is pushed forward with the right standards. So thanks so much again for joining us today. It was a fantastic discussion. And on behalf of both the secretariats of EASAC and FEAM, and especially Johanna, whom you have seen there on the technical side, but you haven't heard from her, we all like to thank you again for your time and for your great comments. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.